In this video, we continue the textual critical work that we began in the previous video on Romans 5:1. So if you have not watched that video, I encourage you to go back and start with that one. We will be engaging the apparatus of the reader's edition of the Greek New Testament, learning how to and practicing how to read it and how to weigh external evidence. This video also presumes that you have watched the two-part introduction to New Testament textual criticism, generally speaking, and we're going to build on some of those ideas and principles here and now. So what we did in our last video on textual criticism of Romans 5:1 is we read the apparatus. We determined the different variants for this particular verse with respect to one particular word in particular. So we learned how to read the apparatus and sort of weigh the evidence, the manuscript evidence, what is called the external evidence to a textual problem. And so the first step in our process of engaging textual criticism and engaging textual variants is to determine the words involved in the variants. And as a reminder, a textual variant is where different manuscripts have different readings. They have different words or phrases at a particular point in time. And what we determined with respect to the variants for Romans 5:1 is that there is a variant with the word ěchomεν or єхомен. You'll notice that I pronounce those two words differently from one another. Ěchomεν with the omicron, o little, o micron. I do as a short ah sound, and as the subjunctive with the omega, o large, I do as the long o sound, єхомен. Not all people make a distinction in the pronunciation of those two vowels, and there is debate as to whether in Paul's first century context, whether or not one would have pronounced the two O vowels differently from one another. And this is going to play into why we might have a variant here. But so our difference is between ěchomεν and the indicative is Paul indicating a fact. We have peace as a fact. This is already the case. Or is it the subjunctive єхомен, which is the mood of possibility or probability? And if it is the mood of possibility or probability, if Paul's using the subjunctive here, he is encouraging an action using what is called the hortatory subjunctive. Let us have peace. Peace is a possibility or a probability, but it's not sort of already indicated as a fact. It's sort of there's a striving for it, as it were. So that's the word involved in our variant, ěchomεν or єхомен, and the Reader's Edition of the Greek New Testament and other editions of the Greek New Testament as well, including UBS, the United Bible Society, and Nestle Aland, both also print the indicative ěchomεν rather than the subjunctive єхоmen. So those are the words involved in our variants. We skipped down to step 3 in the first video on Romans 5:1, and we sort of skipped over the kinds of changes that might be involved in this particular verse. So what I want you to do here is we're going to do a quick lecture pause. There are three possibilities. So there are three possibilities as to the type of change that might be at play with respect to ěchomεν or єхоmen, and I want you to make a quick guess about which three they are. All right, and my hint earlier on was about the pronunciation of omicron versus omega. So there could be a confusion of letters going on here, especially if these two vowels are not really pronounced all that differently in the first century context, and it would be very easy to sort of switch between the two. And then if this is the case, then someone is correcting the spelling either from one to the other, from the indicative to the subjunctive, or from the subjunctive to the indicative, which would explain different versions, different manuscripts for this particular word. That a scribe comes along and they see єхомен with the omicron, and they say, that's not right. I'm going to correct the spelling here to єхомен. Part and parcel with this, or related to this, is that a scribe could come along and be correcting the ideology or theology. They could see what is in their manuscript and say, no, it doesn't make sense for this to be a possible thing. Paul is not encouraging peace. Let us have peace. Paul knows that we have peace already indicated as a fact. So the scribe might then change the word from the subjunctive to the indicative in order to sort of correct the theology, to make it more certain that we presently have salvation, that is indicated as a fact with the indicative mood. So the next thing we do in our process of evaluating textual problems in the Greek New Testament is to evaluate the external evidence. That is what the different manuscripts and manuscripts families have for different variants, and drawing some kind of tentative conclusion about which evidence is best supported. So it's usually best to start with the external evidence and then go from there, because sometimes the external evidence will be very, very clear with respect to which variant is better supported. And so when we looked at the external evidence for Romans 5:1 in the previous video, we found that there are some good witnesses, some strong or weighty witnesses to the indicative ἔχομεν with the O micron, small o, but the early evidence, actually, the best sort of weighty evidence, actually favors the subjunctive mood, that we have sort of more weighty manuscripts supporting the subjunctive. So our tentative conclusion there was the external evidence favors the subjunctive ἔχομεν, let us have peace. All right, and then the next thing that we do is we look at the variants via the principles of internal evidence, thinking about those internal changes, why they might have been made, and look at a number of different things, including whether the variants match the author's style and theology. So thinking, what, in this case, what does Paul normally use? Is he more prone to using the indicative, generally speaking? So that would be across sort of the non-disputed letters, the disputed letters, and Romans in particular, and sort of looking at those and seeing which variant best matches what Paul normally does. And in fact, the indicative, especially in sort of Romans 1 through 8 and even up through 11 or so, is more characteristic of what Paul does than is the subjunctive. That Paul very often uses the indicative in these particular chapters. And then the next sort of principle for internal evidence is preferring the variant that can best explain the others. If you look at the variants and you say, this one makes sense as sort of the root, and you can see why it might have got changed in different kinds of ways, whether intentionally or unintentionally, you then prefer the variant that best explains the other ones. The next principle here is prefer the more difficult reading. The idea here is that it is more likely that a scribe is going to take something difficult and make it easier than they are to take something easier and make it more difficult or less understandable. So the fact that something is more difficult or makes less sense actually seems to indicate that it might be an older variant or a more original variant. And relatedly, the next principle, the last principle here, is to prefer the shorter reading. That a scribe is sort of more likely to expand something in the scriptural text than take something away from scripture. That there's sort of a conservative tendency when it comes to copying and reproducing scripture, not to take things out, not to get rid of stuff. You might add a clarification, but you're less likely to take something away. So when it comes to this resource, the textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, if you're in an exegesis class with the Romans exegesis class with me, this is a recommended, though not required, resource. And the reason that it's recommended and the reason that it's a great resource is what it does is it sort of gives the reasoning why the editorial committee of the Greek New Testament, those that are sort of choosing which ones to actually put in the body, how they made their decision here. So I'm going to read their justification. I've highlighted sort of the most important part here, sort of why they have made the decision that they have. They say, although the subjunctive єχωμεν, let us have peace, has far better external support. So notice they've weighed the external support and say the subjunctive has better manuscript support than does the indicative єχωμεν. A majority of the committee judged that internal evidence, so they looked at the internal evidence, must here take precedence. So they say, despite the fact that we have better supports for subjunctive, we look at the internal evidence and it's so weighty that we went with the indicative rather than the subjunctive. Since in this passage it appears that Paul is not exhorting but stating facts. Peace is the possession of those who have been justified. Only the indicative is consonant with the apostles' argument. So they're looking specifically at how the argument is unfolding in Romans chapter 5. Since the difference in pronunciation between a and o in the Hellenistic age was almost non-existent, so notice that they're alluding to that fact that the omicron and the omega were maybe not pronounced differently in this context. When Paul dictated եկωμεν, Tertius, his amanuensis or scribe, may have written down եկωμεν, and they are going all the way back to Paul's dictation itself. I'm a little skeptical of that move, but they are calling attention to the fact of the difference in pronunciation here. So they ultimately decide that even though եկωμεν is best textually supported, եկωμεν makes best sense. The indicative makes best sense of the context of Romans chapter 5, the argument that's been unfolding, and Paul's own theology. And they're going to say that եկωμεν might have been originally written. So they're taking sort of that, the process or the goal of textual criticism of going back to the original by thinking about Tertius and Paul and the first writing of Romans. So եկωμεν, the subjunctive, might have been originally written, but Paul actually meant եկωμεν. So this is a really interesting case where they say the original reading might have actually been the subjunctive. So they're going to go back and say that we can maybe get to this original reading. It probably was the subjunctive, but Paul didn't mean the subjunctive. So in his mind, he's thinking something else, even though եկωμεν got written here. All right, and then the last step here is to determine which reading you think is oldest and how the other readings alter the experience of the passage. And then I am going to take sort of the newer definition or the newer goal of New Testament textual criticism and not focus so much on the original, because I'm very skeptical that we're ever going to sort of be certain about our originals, what was originally written. And so at the end of the process, for me, what's most important is thinking about how the different variants make the experience or make the meaning of the text a little bit different, not necessarily assuming that different or newer is worse than what you think is older. And so the differences here in interpretation, and this is what I'm going to leave us with, is that with the subjunctive, with the mood of possibility, the encouragement to have peace, let us have peace with God, this is sort of an emphasis on human action, that Paul is encouraging striving for peace within the Roman house churches. He's sort of, if we have the subjunctive, he's sort of putting it on them. He's sort of saying, given all of this stuff from Romans 1-3 about God's impartiality and living as Jews and Gentiles, both worshiping the Jewish God, let's strive to have peace. You all need to work towards peace with God and with one another. Whereas եկωμεν sort of fits more with the argument, or it continues more of the argument that has been made previously, that we have peace with God, or peace with God is a fact, and is sort of laying out of a theological principle here. And to me, եկωμεν especially fits sort of with the way that Paul argues in Romans, really to put the emphasis on God's action in Jesus Christ rather than on our own action, or his the members of his house church's own actions. So to me, like the editors of the Greek New Testament, who look at the external evidence and say the subjunctive is stronger, but internal evidence favors եկωμεν, I also agree that I think internal evidence favors եկωμεν, and it sort of fits with Paul's argument within the context, but also within the way that Paul sort of emphasizes God's action in Jesus Christ in the book of Romans as a whole.